everyone. Hello, hello. I'm Fiona Cawley. I'm the Program Manager for Business and Financial Products with the Globe and Mail. And basically what that means is I help to oversee the awards and rankings programs with Report on Business magazine. And so all those emails you got being like, hey, we need this, or hey, or whatever, that was coming from me and my team. So welcome to everyone. It is lovely to see you here today. It's just been really great back in person and to see everyone in the room. With that, though, I would also like to extend a welcome to those that are joining us virtually as well from across Canada. And first of all, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the Globe and Mail headquarters is situated is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Throughout the afternoon, we will have time for audience questions. Event staff will be circulating around the room with microphones. When a moderator invites questions, please just raise your hand and wait for a microphone. For those in the virtual audience, please just type your questions into the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. We're excited to have the opportunity to bring some of Canada's best executives to the live stage today and to feature others in the video vignettes that will play throughout the afternoon. The Best Executive Awards recognizes the talented leaders who play an invaluable role in ensuring their organizations succeed. The program honors executives across 5 categories: technology, operations, finance, HR, and sales and marketing. You'll see the best executives on slides that will play through the afternoon and, of course, on stage. As the nominations were coming in for this year's award, I have to say I knew we would have a great list. I really do believe that the stories of this year's winners are a perfect example of what this award is meant to encapsulate. Each and every executive on this list was promoted by their colleagues and managers for going above and beyond for the company, for fellow employees, and for clients, often in unpredictable situations from pandemic lockdowns to extreme weather events. And so with that, I would like to ask those 2022 winners that have joined us today to stand, wherever you may be. A big round of applause for them and for all of our Best Executive Award winners this year. Thank you so much. I would also like to recognize our sponsors for making today's event possible. They include Bruce Power, Sprott, Volatus Aerospace, and Walmart. Brand partners include Google and Prairie Sky Royalty. And of course, our academic partners, including DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, Smith School of Business at Queen's, and Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. And now, let's get started with our program. We have great conversations in store over the next 2.5 hours, and we'll conclude with a networking cocktail reception. And now, it is my pleasure to hand things off to my colleague, Timur Durrani, technology reporter with the Globe and Mail. There you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Hello, everyone. I'm Timur Durrani, technology reporter at the Globe and Mail, and I'm delighted to moderate this first panel today. I'll be sitting with 3 of Canada's best executives who had to overcome significant challenges over the past year or so, their lessons learned, and get some advice from them, hear their stories, that kind of thing. Let's meet our group. First, we have Paul Draffin, Chief Supply Officer with Canadian Tire.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Kelly Martin, Chief Financial Officer with Lifelabs Medical Laboratory Services.
Thank you.
And then we have Steve Burmaster, Vice President of Sales with Partake Brewing. Thank you for being here today, Paul, Kelly, and Steve. Let's jump right in. So I'm going to start around with all of you guys giving us a little bit of introduction, telling us a little bit about yourselves and, how it relates to the topic at hand today that we're talking about, the challenges, the things you learned over the past year or so. I'll start with you, Paul.
Sounds good. What can I tell you?
Tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Chief Supply Chain Officer at Canadian Tire Corporation. I've been with Canadian Tire for the last 8 years. Actually, I took on the responsibility for all of global supply chain in June of 2020, so quite a learning experience. I had our global sourcing portfolio, all of our supplier management and our consumer brands division, but obviously in the midst of a pandemic with supply chain, as I kind of quoted, right? I mean, probably the last 10 years, how many times do you hear about supply chain? But we hear about it every day today. So of course, it's been a tremendous opportunity to learn and to grow, but a lot of key learnings, obviously, for the organization and for myself as well.
Kelly, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself today.
So hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Martin. I'm the CFO at Lifelabs, and tomorrow will actually mark my second year anniversary with Lifelabs. So I started in May of 2020, just when the pandemic had hit. So I started virtually. And actually it took me about 1.5 years to first meet my peers and my colleagues that I worked with actually in person. So you can imagine the challenges of having to just kind of orient yourself to a new company and understand the challenges that were immediately being faced by that organization.
I've had to do the same at the Globe as well. I just started here a couple months ago, so I had to do the same. Tell us a little bit about you, Steve, and tell us, how it kind of relates to this at hand and how the past year or so has been for you.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Burmaster. I'm VP of Sales for Partake Brewing. And Partake Brewing is a startup. For those that don't know, we brew great tasting craft non-alcoholic beer. And after 20 years in big CPG companies, I pivoted to a small startup and had to grow that startup through a pandemic, both in Canada and in the US, which has been a unique ride for sure.
Okay, well now we'll start with some questions. I'm going to start with you today, Paul.
Sure.
You told me something that was really interesting, that in the past 2 years, you've seen more growth than you've seen in the last 10 years. How about we start there? Because, Canadian Tire is one of the biggest retailers in Canada, one of the biggest importers as well. Sure. Throughout the pandemic, we saw a spike in demand for recreational products and goods for automotive homes, for example. Tell us a little bit about how that's been like with the growth that you've also seen throughout this.
Yeah, we've got our supply chain practices and technologies that support our business for a long period of time, distribution and fulfillment operations across the country. I think I stand corrected. I should correct what I said. We probably grew about in 2 years what we would have seen in the prior 7 years. So still a tremendous amount of growth. I mean, you're talking about a business that's, it's a legacy business. We've been around for 100 years. We've got a traditional CAGR, or compounded annual growth rate, of about 3.8%. So for a business to grow by 25% over 2 years is challenging. And really stepping into a leadership position of having to take over a supply chain to really process and understand not only the talent, the resources. I mean, we were absolutely strapped in May or June of 2020 when I stepped into the role in terms of trying to frankly keep up with the needs of Canadians and just process what was happening in the pandemic and what were consumers' needs. The practices of inventory management and working capital and cash flow and all these things, and every global shipper was making bets in terms of how much inventory they should acquire, which is risk, right? Lead times were lengthening by the day at that point in time, and so just being able to process and understand, okay, what do we do? And I think, as I mentioned to you, key objective for us, really, my compass is really what's best for the customer, right? What do customers need? And I think we all, for any of us that have kids that were locked in and home and not at school and with their friends, the need to have activities or outdoor activities or backyard living and all these things that we kind of moved or flexed into, of course, was really important for our supply chain, but put a lot of pressure on the business. So again, I think for us, we just led by putting our money where our mouth is, investing in enormous amounts of inventory, working with very, very long lead times. But frankly, it served, in the end, it served the best interests of our business, and I think the best interest of our customers and Canadians.
I want to stay with you a little bit about supply chains. I know a lot of us keep hearing that as a buzzword almost of sorts during the pandemic. It's become a little bit of a meme on Twitter too, in particular, become one of those things. Tell us a little bit about, how that particularly was a challenge for you, because that is part of your role. And it's a big part of when you get that kind of growth, you have to sort of figure out how the supply chain manages around this. So tell us a little bit about how that was.
Yeah, I mean, supply chain it's complicated, and it's not the same for every organization. We have at Canadian Tire Retail, which is our core banner, 40% of our business is directly sourced offshore. So we have staff in Hong Kong and Shanghai and Shenzhen and right across Southeast Asia that are managing factory relationships. So for us, that business is a bit different than the goods that we buy from national brands, a lot of which is acquired domestically, meaning we're not necessarily the importer of record into Canada. Canadian Tire is the largest shipper or importer of record of goods from offshore. So being able to engage with vendors and understand how their lead times are being impacted for material sourcing at a component or materials resource planning level, planning production and scheduling with rolling COVID shutdowns, which obviously in fact took effect there sooner than they did here. And then just understanding our own response in terms of, again, our process of supply chain. So moving the goods by ocean, getting them to, through the Port of Vancouver, Halifax, railing them across the country, getting them to store, and/or, e-com and looking after last mile fulfillment and delivery. So it's really all of those things. With tremendous, a lot of different challenges at each kind of node of the supply chain throughout, the last couple of years, and a lot of pressure, of course, with just the process of acquiring materials, supplier lead times, and all these kinds of things. And then, of course, what became very popular in the media was chasing ocean freight and just getting the ocean capacity we needed to, to move our goods, which we, I think we're in a better position today than for sure we were last year. But this has been an ongoing challenge, and of course, the Canadian supply chain itself is under a lot of pressure today.
So Kelly, I want to go to you. A lot of people think that you're at Lifelabs. It might be something that you might have seen a lot of growth during the pandemic, but it wasn't something in the early days of the pandemic that was the case, right? Tell us a little bit about that. How was that like in the early days?
Yeah, so you can imagine, so Lifelabs provides essential services to Canadians, diagnostic lab services, and immediately, because of all the shutdowns and everyone being isolated and having to isolate, we immediately saw huge drops in our volumes of testing services that, people were not coming into our locations to have blood drawn and things like that, and samples collected. However, but because we provide that essential service, one of our first orders of business was making sure that our employees were safe in the delivery of the service that they had to do. And thankfully, our procurement team had been, thinking about these things and business continuity planning and things like that. And we actually had quite a bit of pandemic supply of PPE. So personal protective equipment, masks, gowns. So we had to learn new protocols. We had to manage through all of that, including the financial aspects of having to deal with these new costs that were coming into the P&L that we hadn't experienced before. There was a lot of horse trading going on for PPE at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I know that we were instrumental in helping some of our health institutions still maintain their abilities to ensure that their employees were also safe in the delivery of healthcare services for Canadians. So that was the initial things we had to deal with. And then financially, thinking about, okay, let's make sure we're stable financially now that we have seen these volumes come off. So what do we have to do? So there were some drastic measures we were taking. We had to look at our capital spending, make sure we were still had enough liquidity to manage our working capital. So we had to immediately look for an additional bank line to help us out. So that was quite a bit of work pulling all of that together. And then just ensuring that working capital was being maintained. So timing of capital spend, looking at our expenses, looking at all our discretionary expenses. We even had to take some layoffs as well to have to deal with some of the cost pressures that we were facing throughout the first part of the pandemic. Yeah, for sure. It was very difficult and very stressful time for the organization. But you have resiliency, and you had to deal with those short-term immediate issues.
I want to stick with you for a little bit. I want to talk about, the cash flow and financial side of things, because that's something you touched on a little bit during the early days that you really had to think about. Tell us a little bit about that. What other things that people can learn from, things that you had to do yourself during that period?
Right. So looking at your I don't think Lifelabs before I had got there actually had done the detailed cash flows on a weekly and daily basis. So we started pulling together some modeling to be able to manage those and understanding what was happening with our debt covenants on a monthly basis, and our working capital. And as I said, we looked at our capital spending and really had to reallocate where we were spending money, looking at our priority projects, particularly as it was relating to COVID. We had to make investments in technology. We had to make investments in some new equipment, which we had never had before, to meet this increasing demand for COVID testing. And we're now proud to say that we've done almost 5 million COVID tests for Canadians across Ontario and BC. And then just looking at those discretionary costs, looking at your labor is one of a very large cost for the organization. And so looking at what we could do around labor and temporary layoffs, those kinds of things. We looked at temporary closures of some of our sites that we could still manage volumes within particular locations within Ontario and BC. So we had to deal with that as well. So a lot of different things you kind of have to take into consideration as you're managing and balancing, what's appropriate for the organization and then what's appropriate for your balance sheet and your working capital. So.
Steve, you come in with a very interesting perspective here, because you moved from a small, from a large enterprise to a small startup, right? It is something that developed as the pandemic went on. Tell us a little bit about that. How was that like? The perspective of that challenge itself, moving from one type of a business to another.
Yeah, so I come from Unilever and Maple Leaf Foods, two very large CPG companies that have a lot of systems, a lot of processes, a lot of sales, and growth rates that are in single digits generally. To go into something that was brand new, hadn't been created, a category that was exploding, and we were the first mover here in Canada. So we were looking to expand here and accelerate through the pandemic here in the Canadian marketplace, and then also start our business in the United States. So with Canada, the challenge was accelerating during the pandemic, looking at our business model, which was primarily D2C and grocery, with some on-premise, but as we all know, on-premise disappeared through the pandemic. So we had to accelerate our D2C business, which went from 10% of our business to almost 40% in the first couple months of the pandemic. Accelerating grocery here with consumers buying stuff in store, looking for consumption at home, which was a big thing for us. And then the other really interesting thing is with the United States, we didn't have much of a business there. So as a salesperson, I'm making every single sales call on Zoom, trying to sell them on a product or a category that they may not believe in quite yet from a company up in Canada. A little bit of a stretch, but I'm proud to say that we opened up 22 different markets in the United States. We're the second largest craft brewer in the United States for NA. We're now the #1 NA up here in Canada. And so we have, through the pandemic, we have grown quite substantially and quite successfully.
You know what, I think that's the perfect place for us to start with the next theme of our topic, with something I think a lot of people are talking about now, and as we should continue to talk about the people that we work with and the people, as part of our businesses and whatnot, right? And I'll start with you, Steve, because you mentioned something about your operations in the US and having to figure out how to be on Zoom calls with people and that kind of a thing, which we're all still relating to a lot. Tell us about how you think that's evolving with the future of business. Is that where you think things are going? Because before this, it used to be a lot of hopping on airplanes, right? But that's not necessarily the case anymore. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I will say one thing. I mean, we saved a ton of money on T&E for through the pandemic. I don't know if we would have been able to do what we did if it wasn't for that reduction. I'd say that what we learned was that we have to pivot very quickly. So our on-premise folks are people who are sales reps calling on bars and restaurants. We ensured that they still had work to do, and we didn't lay anyone off, thankfully. In the US, we delayed hiring. We didn't need the same people calling on individual locations or individual retailers because we could do it on Zoom. So I think for us, and being a startup, we have to be smart with our cash flow. So it really is about efficiency and how quickly can we get get it done? And is it worth that 10-minute meeting in Seattle to hop on a plane, or can you do it over Zoom? And so that's for us, is that constant balancing act. But what we are seeing in the US versus Canada right now is the United States is ready to get going. They are wide open, and they're demanding that we are down there and being in front of them. So.
You were just talking to me about Las Vegas, right? That was a big shock for you.
Yeah, we had a trade show that was National Beer Wholesalers. It sounds like a good time, but it is a business meeting. But what I would say is, I mean, here in Ontario, we were all masked up, and the U.S. trade show, it was masks are off, it's business as usual, let's go. And so that was a little bit of an eye-opener in terms of how Canada versus the U.S. approaches business.
Kelly, I want to talk to you about something you mentioned earlier about, because you had to adjust to things in a remote environment, right? Like I had to too. How was that like for you, adjusting to things in that environment and moving into a role that you did?
Yeah, so being the head of finance, and trying to be influential in this time of the pandemic, it really required a lot of effort to build relationships, even though they were virtual relationships at the time. So spending that time that you would, normally spend in a room like this and being able to network with a ton of people, it was more individual, a lot of individual connections being made, not only with my peers, but also the people who worked for me. And who were in my team. So really then trying to do fun things over Zoom. We had lots of different games that we were playing just to kind of break the ice a little bit, but also trying to influence as well without like authority or without having direct seeing people and being able to talk to them. Trying to do that through multiple different communication means, whether that was phone, whether that was Zoom, whether that was email, and just, any way you could, you were trying to make connections with people. We had probably more regular meetings as an ELT, obviously due to the pandemic and all the short-term issues. Like we were meeting every day at noon. There was a leadership meeting, but even still, we still meet now once a week, and so there's still that connection with the peer group and the people that you're working with. And so having all those regular touch points, still set up town halls, still did communication meetings. So just trying to get out there as much as you could, even though it was still being virtual. So lots more time spent.
Paul, I want to talk to you a little bit about, you talked about how there was a growth that you'd seen that was kind of, you need to match that on some level as well. So that meant hiring more people perhaps, right? Was that the case for Canadian Tire?
I mean, certainly there was some expansion of our workforce for sure. I think, we definitely relied on the talent that was already in the business to really, I don't want to say sweat the assets, but the truth is that it was difficult, especially at the beginning, in terms of dealing with recruiting and HR and what, I think we were trying to find our feet in terms of how we'd grow and how do we, accommodate and scale the business. So I think we really relied on the core talent of the business that we had to kind of get us through probably the first 12 months or so. And financially, of course, we didn't really know what kind of outcomes to expect, right? While you're growing, you don't know. You could grow quickly, and then you could, that could reverse itself as well. So I think you've got, of course, folks like Kelly, you've got finance folks that are, watching over your shoulder to make sure that you're being careful and you're being careful and mindful of the decisions that you're making. So yeah, no, we didn't really expand our workforce too much, but we're until I'd say we get into 2021 and understand, okay, what's our rhythm, what are the needs of the business, and and having the right strategies in place to attract and recruit the right talent to even start and work remotely, where of course this was new for all of us. Yeah.
I want to go around all three of you, and you can chime in here. Tell us a little bit about what you think the future of now, this remote sort of thing that we've gotten used to, is looking like, because we're now finally seeing people in person. Today we have a bunch of people here in person that we're doing this kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about whether you think Zoom meetings are still going to be something that you're going to do more of, or how that's sort of looking like now. And I'll start with you, Paul, about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think everyone in this room has this on their mind. I think we as human beings, we process this differently, and of course we want to have, it's easy for us to have policies, and and we're think binary, right? Like what are we doing? It's 2 days a week or 3 days a week. We used language in Canadian Tire, which was around virtual first, and then we started talking about hybrid. But I think at the end of the day, and we spent a lot of time as a leadership team talking about this recently. I think we have to flex to the needs of our talent. I think we need to, we need to be focusing on outcomes. That's what drives us. And as long as we're realizing the outcomes that we need, we have to be flexible. We have to be flexible to attract and retain the best talent. And the nice thing is that as a Canadian organization, it doesn't mean that that all of our employees have to be in Canada. If we have a virtual environment, we can hire folks in other countries or wherever it makes sense to accommodate the needs of the business. So I think we're really leaning into and working through. I don't think we have an exact answer to your question. That's the truth. I think we're trying to be as flexible and as accommodating as we can, as an understanding of our talent. But we're not directionally saying, it's 2 days or 3 days a week. We're trying to figure it out. And in the meantime, stay very focused on how's the business performance. Are we realizing the outcomes that we need to achieve, and including our shareholder expectations. And I think that if that sustains and we can do it, then that'll help us determine our path forward. So between now and then, I think we're trying to be flexible and accommodating.
Right, because it does keep shifting, right? Like it's like you're thinking of one thing and then it moves to the next. Kelly, how about you tell us a little bit about how that was like for you?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know what's going to happen. We're, as my boss would say, we're one variant away from another pandemic kind of thing, right? And so we don't know what's going to happen as it relates to this virus and where it's going to take us. But I think the order of the day, as Paul said, is it's about flexibility, right? It's being able to balance not only being able to do stuff online, which, by the way, we all learned we can be very, very productive because we don't have to spend hours in the car. And we can actually have a much more balanced life. You can go and have your nice early morning coffee, or go for a jog at lunch, or go out for a walk. It got a lot more flexible. However, there is still a balance between ensuring that you can maintain that connectivity with your employees, right? And it's really hard to build loyalty if they don't see you. And that's one thing that I found. So you have to balance the in-person activities against the Zoom and the virtual meetings. We are not going to go back as our head office team. We're not going back into the office to work. We are going to be working remotely. There's only a few positions of head office positions that are going to be in the office. So it will still require that effort and balance between kind of the virtual as well as the in-person events. So,
Steve, how about you?
I mean, we're in a little bit of different position. We're opening up our office here in Toronto. We just opened it up this month. We're all over the continent. So my U.S. head of sales is in Austin, Texas. I've got people in California, in Seattle, and in the Northeast. So we are remote regardless. We will continue to be remote for the foreseeable future, just because of our footprint and the size of our organization. But what I do see is the need to be in front of people, to be able to look them in the eye and sell them on that product, talk to them about the product, introduce consumers to your product. And you can't do that via Zoom. You can't do that as much digital spend as you want. You can't do it that way either. So I think there is a need to be in front of people, to have that connectivity while still being flexible. And I look to one of the core things of us, and our brand name is about partaking, being able to partake in a moment, being able to be being part of that inclusivity. And so we will balance the needs of our employees and how we can get them involved in the business or included in the business. And but I think there is going to be remote, and there's going to be a lot of in-person stuff going forward. It's not going to be what it was before, but it's definitely different.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit to talk about the opportunities that arose from the pandemic, because, a lot of people were talking about challenges, but there have been some opportunities as well. As you mentioned, there's a lot of maybe positive things that have come out of it because you've had to think about those things differently, right? And I think for you, Steve, that was something that you had to think about, the on-premise business model that you had before, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so our business grew by over 2,000% over the last 3 years. So it's been very successful through the pandemic. But our on-premise business was shut down, and the idea in BevAlc is that you can grow the business by sampling it in bars and restaurants, and then consumers will buy it at home. With NA, with non-alcoholic beer, that's not the case. So we were able to pivot our resources to in-home consumption, D2C, and really drive it that way. So the pandemic was an opportunity for that. It was also an opportunity because people were consuming at home. After that jog that you may have had at noon, you may have wanted a beer. And you probably still had to work. So an alcoholic beer probably wasn't your best option. So people were having non-alc beer during the day. And then other people may have had too many alcoholic beverages and may have wanted to cut back. And so what we are seeing is a swing on the health benefits of non-alcoholic beer. And our beer is 10 calories for an entire can of beer, which you want to know what that plays into what happened during the pandemic. So the pandemic was a lot of growth opportunity for us. We see further growth because of we're actually able to get out to see our customers, get out to the consumers, and really tell the brand story.
See, I had no idea that a beer could ever be 10 calories.
Impressive.
Kelly, how about Lifelabs? Because you had to disrupt a lot of the traditional approaches
Right.
from that business point of view, right? So tell us a little bit about how that process was like, and maybe the opportunities that arose from that sort of disruption that you did there.
Yeah, so typically in healthcare, as everyone knows, the processes to make change are quite long, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and things like that. And for us to bring new tests to market, it would normally have taken months and months to do that. But we had to start, there was unprecedented demand for PCR testing. And this is a very specific type of testing. Now, we did thankfully have some pieces of equipment, but we had to invest in more equipment because we weren't able to run that kind of volume through. We were looking to try and run about 20,000 tests a day versus maybe the 100 that we had normally been running or less through those pieces of equipment. So within basically days and weeks, we were able to bring up those pieces of equipment where typically they would have taken months and months to do. So that was one amazing thing that the organization, through its agility and focus, we were able to bring that testing up, hire the right talent or move talent from other parts of our business where we were seeing declines in volume over into that specific type of testing, develop those protocols and do it really, really quickly and get the quality of the results, and our quality assurance team approving and validating these new protocols. So that was unprecedented, very, very fast. And as I had said before, we're now upwards of almost 5 million PCR tests running. In addition to that, we started to see with everyone being isolated, this huge demand for digital services, for visiting your doctor online, for being able to actually observe you doing testing, your own sample collection for particularly COVID samples. And so over the course of the pandemic, we've seen huge changes in the business model around how these kinds of services are delivered, with now more acceptance around digital health and the things that are happening virtually, and being able to deliver those services. We've had to move to collection on site at work locations. We've moved to production studios. We've done a lot of work in the travel industry now to help Canadians travel and come back into the country as well as leave the country. And so being able to just flux the services that we provided typically around just sample collection, logistics services, and even just the testing pieces are all being done in very different ways than we would normally have done them. So it's really expedited, the way we think about healthcare and how do we get closer to our patients and our customers going forward.
That's a really good point, because I think a lot of people talk about how, and economists that I talk to a lot tell us that some of the trends that we were already heading towards have been expedited during the pandemic, right? Or either been completely shifted and taken to the other direction that was sort of the plan B that a lot of companies were thinking about. But one model that has always stuck around for a while has been the retail model for a lot of companies, right? It's shifted a little bit, but it's stuck that way in a lot of ways. Was that the case during the pandemic for Canadian Tire? Did you see that sort of the way that it stuck to that model? How are your sort of operational changes impacting opportunities that might have arose?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, if anyone knows, a little bit of the history of CT during the pandemic, of course, we were letting Canadians down all over the place with respect to e-commerce, because of course we were closed. I mean, we had huge restrictions on our retail stores and retail footprint across the country. And again, as you said, this whole pandemic became a huge accelerator, not to our business strategy, but also to technology enablement. I mean, we deployed so much resources in the early part of 2020 to get to stand up a better e-com and more scalable e-com experience. I mean, we went from e-com penetration of probably 2 or 3% to, at a point in time, 35%, 40% of business. It took time. But again, it's allowed us to think, about the digital backbone of the company and what do we need to do and how do we flex. And, that's obviously changed. I mean, e-com now is 8% of the business, but it's okay. We gained a lot of key learnings that have allowed us to build resiliency into our business that will sustain us for years to come. I think from a bricks and mortar standpoint, when we spoke previously, I mentioned, it's allowed us the time and the opportunity to really think about our long-term, kind of 5-year, 10-year strategy and focus on things that we wouldn't be focused on otherwise. I mean, if not for the pandemic, we would have had the capacity that we needed to kind of meet the growth needs of the business. We didn't. And so we're kind of being more thoughtful about our supplier relationships, and supplier relationships, I think, for all of us are more important now than they've ever been, making sure that we're with the right suppliers, those that are supporting our business, but thinking about our fulfillment strategies, our replenishment strategies, our node strategy for, again, it's a little bit complicated, but in terms of inbound and outbound capacity management, we didn't have the capacity within our distribution network to fulfill the needs of our stores. So when I got into the role, I said, well, why can't we extend our EDI, our technology capabilities, to a third-party warehouse to fulfill orders to stores? Do we have any existing facilities that are storage only that could be turned on as outbound nodes? So I mean, it's all these things in terms of innovative thinking and creative problem solving that it's not an event. It's really it's an agility, I think, that you add, and it becomes a skill going forward.
Yeah. We'll have some time for questions as well from the audience. But before that, some of the last questions that I'll ask are about your roles, and specifically because I think it was something interesting. And I'll start with you, Kelly, on this, because not a lot of people like talking about finances. So we'll start there. How is the role of CFO changing, and how is that sort of evolving as a result of everything going on?
Well, I think it's, you always have to maintain your stewardship as over the assets of the organization, but it's about how do you kind of throw away some of the old paradigms that you're looking at and move forward in a faster way, instead of spending hours and days building models about things that have to be like so perfect. They don't have to be that perfect. They just can be directional. You have to just understand your assumptions and be able to then move forward and make a decision as quickly as you possibly can with only the information that you have, right? Sometimes we were doing calculations really on the back of a napkin. People might not want to hear me say that, but it was like, okay, what's the main things we know? Okay, good, it's good, we've got to go, we've got to move. So it's just, being able to pull in speed as well as process and do that quicker in a much more agile way, as Paul was saying. For sure.
Some of the best ideas come from the back of the head. Yeah, so the best ideas happen over there. Something that I think is really interesting is sales and marketing in a very crowded space, though, right? So tell us a little bit about how that's been like for you.
Yeah, I'd say that it's as a sales and marketing person, it's hard not to be in front of people physically, not be able to get that reaction, to be able to pitch something across the table. I think that's the hardest part. But Zoom has enabled the other, speed to market has enabled other things there. So I think going forward, I can't wait to get back in front of more people, to get out there and see those customers, see our consumers. But there will be that balance between it. I think you're going to have to pick your spots efficiently, especially with an organization the size of ours. We have to be, we're a startup, so we've got to make sure that we're doing it at the right spots and making it the biggest impact at the right times, instead of going through the paces, which is very often what you can get into in a sales and marketing world, where it's annual rhythms and annual planning, and you have to go to these meetings on a quarterly basis. When you're trying to sell something and accelerate a business, it's picking your spots and making the most out of those. That's very
I
secret.
don't envy your position selling things on Zoom. I don't know how I would do that.
I did it with 2 kids at home, and I had to hide in my daughter's room, and they'd often be like, why is there a ballerina dress behind you? I'm like, don't worry about it. You want beer. It's okay. So it was...
Yeah, I think back to when people used to joke about that one, video that went viral of like the person on TV with like the kid going in the back, and then how now during the pandemic that's happened to so many of us, we don't even talk about that.
Don't even talk about it. Yeah, exactly.
And then I will get you to go last, sort of, Paul. Tell us a little bit about, the role of supply chain became, as we talked about, a little bit of a buzzword, but still people don't understand it completely. Is that something, you've faced as well, trying to explain supply chains to people that might not get it?
Fortunately, we don't need to sell and market that. I mean, it's, it's operational. So, I mean, the business that we're in, it relies on it. So the folks in our business understand it. I think it's just, from a consumer standpoint, it's understanding, whether it's the food that you're eating at your dinner table or you're preparing at home or the things that we buy when we're out shopping. How do these things get to where they are, right? So it's just kind of taking that right to the back. But, Sir, I'm not sure if you had another question there.
Well, how about we maybe start off with some questions in the audience? If you guys have any questions, we'll pass around a mic. Is there any questions that we have maybe from the audience? If we don't hear, then we'll probably go online. Yeah?
Yeah, so a question from the audience about supply chain disruptions arising from the situation in Ukraine and also restrictions in China. Is that something that is on the panelists' minds?
How about we start with you, Paul, because that's something you would be able to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely it is on our mind. I'll talk about Ukraine first. I mean, fortunately for us, we didn't have a lot of exposure. I won't say Ukraine, because with all due respect, I think we're quite supportive and sympathetic to, what's happening to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people. We don't source goods. I think we had a national brand vendor with some tire production out of Russia, which we've since moved to Germany as an example. But of course, that kind of decision making happened overnight in terms of what we're going to do or what we're not going to do. I think I've spent years living in Asia, so I'm very close to that part of the world, and of course have people there that report into me. I think a lot of the things that we read in the news, I do think, from my perspective, have a bit of a Western bias in terms of how things are going or they're not going. I'd say. And I won't comment on China's zero COVID policy. That is what it is. From a pure supply chain standpoint, I would tell you that the outlook is actually better today than it has been in the last 2 years. The ability to get and acquire ocean capacity, manage the bookings process. We've all kind of adapted our lead times, so we've lengthened our lead times to kind of deal with all the challenges of supply chain anyway. So I think, but we're focused on it. This is something that we're looking at every single day to make sure that we're kind of getting the inventory and the goods that we need on time. So yeah, it's on our minds, and we actively manage it.
Steve, Kelly, do you want to add to that?
I can add a little bit to it, not so much from a supply chain perspective, but more from what my customers are coming to me on and what our main, the first question they ask is, do you have supply? The second question they're asking is, are you taking price? So those are 2 questions that are coming up recurring. And what we've had to do in order to balance that is build up inventory levels and ensure that we can meet the needs of our customers. So it's a little bit of a different way to look at it, but I'm getting it from, can you meet what we need, and are you increasing? And we are seeing increases across all inputs, but it is a question we're getting from every one of our customers.
Kelly, do you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, so ours is a little bit of a different situation because of the services that we provide. Our inventories are very, very specific to those services. So, and as I had talked about before with the PPE and making sure we had enough quantities on hand to help ensure that our employees were safe when they were delivering the services, but also making sure we had test tubes and things like that. So we have had to manage very carefully with our with our suppliers and making sure that we do have enough to meet the volumes that are coming through our door on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes it has been day-to-day that we've had to manage that, but thankfully we haven't run into any problems. But on the financial side of things, I will add though that there has obviously been inflationary pressure, right? So there has been, the cost of things have gone up, masks have escalated, gloves has escalated, and so just trying to manage and understand understand the impacts of that inflationary pressures across all parts of our supply chain has been very challenging. Fuel, we're dealing with fuel price increases as well because we have logistics services where we're moving samples around. So those are where we're really seeing that hit, and that's kind of my perspective on it as well. So.
Do we have any other audience questions? Yeah. Okay. Would we?
Hello, thank you. Hi, my name is Camila. I would like to hear from you about sustainability, about recycling, proper destination. We have been utilizing more and more plastic, consuming much more, and I would like to know if sustainability is part of your agenda.
Good question. Yeah. Who wants to go first?
I can start if you want. Yeah, I mean, I think, you're spot on. I think, and this is true, I'd like to think it's true for all of us, but yeah, absolutely. In terms of our strategic mandate, we'll be coming out with kind of new principles shortly, but it's really important, especially as a retailer, in terms of the products that we acquire, the processes that are involved in the production of our goods, including the consumption of materials, like you mentioned, plastics. It's incredibly important. I think we'll be stating our own position shortly as it relates to net zero and carbon emissions and the goals and objectives. And I think it's complicated. I think the other thing. So your question is really important. I think it's easy for current leadership of any organization to talk about what outcomes they want to realize 20 years from now, but will the leadership still be around? So we're trying to be realistic about setting goals that are not only attainable, but that can be transitioned from throughout leadership. But yes, I agree. We want to achieve more environmentally sustainable outcomes, and we'll as an organization you'll see that being communicated from us shortly.
Yeah. Do you guys want to add to that as well?
I can add a little bit. I mean, through the pandemic, we used to be in plastic rings. I think everybody's seen them. They're 6-pack rings. We eliminated those because of the sustainability and the plastics that are associated with it, and we've gone to all corrugate. And I think the pandemic has allowed us to utilize Zoom, which has reduced a lot of our carbon footprint from flying around. Exactly to my point about picking and choosing where you need to be and whether that's worth that 10-minute meeting in Seattle or whatever it may be. So, it's top of mind for us. We're a smaller organization, and we'll pick and choose where we can do it. But we're making those steps because our consumers, especially in the beer industry, are looking for that from us. Craft brewers have often been at the forefront of this sort of sustainability, and we're in that space.
Mm-hmm. And I'll get you to end that, Kelly.
Yeah, just in the lab for sure. Like we are very environmentally friendly. We invest significant amounts of money in terms of our clean water purification systems that we have in all of our labs, all of our waste disposal, and now looking to try and set goals, as Paul said, around our carbon emissions, because we are running a fleet of vehicles and just wanting to ensure that those vehicles are going to be reduced carbon emissions as we go forward. So it's absolutely on the minds of our leadership team and how we can ensure that all of the different parts of our business are being able to contribute to that.
Okay, we have to leave it here. That was our panel, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. And now we have a short video featuring another one of Canada's best executives. Let's take a look.
It's really important that the entire business community and all of us as Canadians, that we lean in and we do everything we can to tackle climate change. And that means taking net zero seriously. Achieving net zero is going to take more than declarations or plans. It's going to take action. And here at Bruce Power, we are committed to being a net zero company by 2027. But more importantly, we're committed to ensuring Ontario and Canada meet their net zero goals by 2030 and 2050. And we're at the leading edge in terms of achieving that and fighting climate change. And that's why here at our site, which is part of Canada's largest infrastructure project, we're making sure this clean electricity assets are going to be here for decades to come to meet that goal. It's absolutely critical that we work with Indigenous communities and we move forward together on a path towards reconciliation. Our facility here at Bruce Power is located on the traditional territories of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the traditional harvesting territories of the Métis Nation of Ontario and historic Saugeen Métis. We are committed to working together to develop new economic opportunities, consultation, engagement, but more importantly, we have a very innovative project with the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation related to making life-saving medical isotopes. It's a partnership we've structured together. So not only are we moving forward on a path to reconciliation, we're joining hands together to fight cancer, not only here in Canada, but around the world. I have no doubt that technology is going to be an absolutely central pillar to achieving our broad goals when it comes to human health, fighting cancer, net zero. But what we need to keep in mind when we're talking about technology is always created and driven by people. And technology that is created and driven by people is for people. And so oftentimes we like to focus on the engineering or the technical work or the various infrastructure work that we're doing, but we can't lose sight of the fact that it's all about people. So technology is going to be really important, but it's going to be smart, dedicated, innovative, forward-thinking people that create that technology for the benefit of Canadians.
Great. And now I would like to hand it off to my colleague Dayo to moderate the next session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. What? Hello?
Can you hear me?
What? Okay, let's try this again. I'm nothing if not raised in the church. And when I was raised in the church, there was call and response. And then I can tell if people are really into this. I know you're a business community, but I thought business communities had good times, made good cash, all of this. Let's try this again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. All right. I think there's a crowd here. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, T. Moore. My name is Dayo, and I'm a content strategist with the Globe Content Studio here at the Globe and Mail. I'm also the daughter of 2 teachers, and who else is a child of teachers? Okay, so you know how you would sometimes be growing up and you would do school, that kind of thing, and we're talking about lessons in leadership today. And often for those who remember school, usually there are some people that are called on to give answers, usually the front people. Do you remembering this? So I'm going to be calling on a couple of tables to offer a bit of insight into something that may not be cozy to talk about, but it's part of learning as we grow in business, which are leadership hacks, leadership fails. Who here wants to admit that they've had a leadership fail? No one. I saw a hand. I saw another hand. 2 women and a man now have offered hands, and another. So I think we have some leadership hacks that we might be talking about later on today, and I might be calling on a couple of tables to offer a bit of insight. And since I remember which hands were, I might come to those people. This nodding head over here will get called on. So I'm really excited to be here. You might have seen in the write-up that we had Pauline Dillon was going to come, but she couldn't make it today. But we are very excited to bring on Nancy Nazir, who is with OMERS and is going to be coming up to the podium. If you want to give her a hand, just to welcome her up. And Nancy and I are going to have a great chat about leadership. But as I've tried to explain, this is a conversation not just here, but with the whole room. So don't be surprised if I come back to you to talk and chit-chat too. So I'm going to go over to Nancy. Hi, Nancy.
I got a good look at all the hands that went up too, so I'll help you with that.
Thank you. Yeah. That's amazing. So let's jump right into the conversation around lessons in leadership.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about lessons that you've learned. As we heard in the last chat, we talked a lot about the pandemic, and we've all talked and thought and lived through a lot around the pandemic. But you were a leader way before the pandemic. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about lessons that you brought before the pandemic that helped you through the pandemic.
I think it's just really important to acknowledge that we're all leaders. I don't think, we wake up one day and put a title, but we have to earn that role of leadership. And leadership means many different things. It's not the titles, it's what we do every day in terms of the impact and influence we have on one another. So for me, in my journey most recently, at least in the last 2 years, thank you so much. My kids tell me I'm pretty loud, so they'll be surprised that I need a mic. But the lessons that I've learned, at least most recently, is that how much has been condensed in the last 2 years for many of us. I'm sure you can relate to what I'm saying, is sometimes it takes a lifetime to go through what we've been going through. So it's almost like those dog years that we've experienced. And I joined OMERS, and I truly feel blessed to be there 2 years ago. So it was in the April timeframe. And it was a promotion for me. So I became head of HR there in a global organization. And you're at that point in your career, you go, I think I'm ready, but your gut's saying, I'm not sure, and you've got the butterflies. Those are the best times to make a move, because if you're 100% sure, don't do it. And I think in March, things just got shut down. And I thought, okay, you know what? It's just going to be a couple weeks, and it'll be business as usual. And I've got my leadership toolkit from other organizations, and I'll just,
apply
rinse
it
and repeat,
Yes.
of course. But then the world just changed. And I know we're a little fatigued with hearing about the pandemic, but the world changed. Like, show of hands, how many felt at the onset the world changed? Well, at least for my husband, the world changed. He was out there at Home Depot trying to find every mask there was possible. He found a few that were like at the bottom of the shelf.
Maybe they were found at Canadian Tire.
He did try Canadian Tire as well. And then he bought home a lot of cans of beans. That was before we knew that there was a supply chain issue with toilet paper. But the world changed, and I think leadership took on an entirely new role for many of us. And for me, at least personally, the toolkit that applied and made me successful in the past, which was a lot of empathy and connecting with people, I realized that I wasn't going to meet the people that I was working with, and I had to find new ways to foster trust in an organization that people were there and knew one another for many years, and they had stories and different relationships that they had formed. So it's working in that white space, redefining success, redefining your own vulnerability, which is okay.
So how did you have to redefine your own vulnerability?
I had to have courage. I had to say it's okay to maybe I'm going to fail. And I have to be authentic to who I am and not lose in terms of where I came from and experiences that I've had, and sharing that, but often sharing it in two-dimensional forms. So you're speaking to people, but you don't know who you're speaking to. So you don't know if you are capturing emotions or not. And I think that was the big thing for me, is that courage of saying, I'm just going to take a level of risk, base it on my gut instinct. And again, we know leadership is a contact sport. And if we don't have some of the scar tissue to show our successes and failures, and the failures are the most important, then we're never going to succeed. So it was a lot of risk taking, but knowing enough to say, there's some experiences that I've had, and the context has changed, but I'm going to try my best. And I think the biggest learning for me was enabling the team. So many of us feel as leaders we have to lead from the front, but learning how to lead from the side and from behind.
That's interesting. So would you say you were someone that used to always lead from the front, and then you had to kind of sideline and back end it a little bit?
Yeah, at 5-0, you kind of like those little dogs that bark loud. I was definitely leading from the front for a lot of my career, and taking that leadership role of, having a voice, having a vision. And what I learned very fast is I needed to listen differently, because the world had changed and people were different. They weren't as committed in the same manner, because we were reevaluating our own lives and reassessing what we valued. So I think, then you realize that I can't lead from the front, because maybe no one's going to be following me. How do I lead from the side or from behind. And that's a reset of your mind shift as well.
As a similar short person.
Yes.
I'm actually taller than you, which is really exciting.
Yes, so is most of this room.
But, I'm Caribbean background. There's a phrase that you hear, I'm small, but I'm talawa. How many people know what that might mean? How would you explain that? Small but mighty.
Nice, yeah.
So I give that to you as something you can take into
What I
Omer's.
heard a lot when people first met me for the first time, some visited me at my home, they're like, you sound a lot taller than you look. Like that's it. So the joys of being in Zoom meetings was, I guess I sound louder and taller. But it is just, again, we had to reevaluate. Many of us have had growth in a short period of time, again, experiencing things that we've never had to experience. When we saw what was happening in terms of social, political inequality, Black Lives Matters, when you think about what that meant, the emotions that created, well-being challenges that people were experiencing, burnout, the blur of working from home or being in the front line, and then, the great resignation. So when you bring all that together, leadership does matter, and it's a new form of leadership that we have to embody as we move forward.
It's a lot, definitely, and we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that it's Mental Health Week this week, so we'll touch on that a little later. But that brings us, actually, you've talked a bit about the leadership fails that you've had, and I thought maybe you can get the ball rolling, because we are going to go to the audience as well, and share a little bit about lessons in vulnerability, which you said that you experienced. Often leaders don't like to talk about things that don't work, but I think one thing we've learned in this pandemic is that, among other things, is that we're human, that we don't always get it right, that sometimes we need to tweak things and fix things. What have you learned about yourself in terms of a leadership issue, whether it happened in the past couple years or maybe 20 years ago?
I have had so many failures, and I don't think it's the failure, but it's just reflecting on the learning. And the biggest one is sharing your vulnerability when you failed. I always bring my inner circle, my direct team. They're kind of like my family, and I will bring them in. So I remember, this is before Omer's, that I was in a meeting and it went horrible, like really, really horrible.
What happened? Take us there.
It just, when you just go in and you go, I'm not ready to do this, and the message, I didn't buy into the message, but I had to deliver something that I didn't fundamentally believe in.
Yeah.
And, but I went in, and you go in and you try to get yourself as energized. I need some of that non-alcoholic beer, and go in and do my best. And it just didn't go well. And then, you have a group of people around you who are not buying it. And I just felt like I knew it wasn't going to go well, and just spiraled and got worse and worse. And I felt horrible. But the reality was, and I was delivering a message for someone else, so that's always a lesson learned is, don't be the messenger.
Right.
And, but
especially if you don't believe it.
If you don't believe it. So I should have spoken up earlier, but it was in a very, it was like, you're going to do this and don't question it. But what worked for me in that lesson is, I lost sleep over it, but was working with my team afterwards and saying, these are lessons, this is what went wrong, this is how it started to spiral, but I want to share it with you, not because I'm feeling sorry for myself, but I want to share it with you because I want to be better, and I want you to grow through my experience. And I think if we can create psychological safety with our teams, we spend so much time at work with people that we work with. But if you can't be safe to be vulnerable, I think the pandemic has allowed us, because it's blurred the lines as we've worked in our children's rooms and closets, bathrooms, I've seen it all. But I just think if we can be vulnerable and create that safety and trust with one another, you just support it. And so that it doesn't feel like a failure, it feels like a learning. And I think that's the shift, that it's never a failure. It's just a learning that we can grow on and have a story to tell in the future. And if we don't have these stories, we weren't just born leaders. We have to grow. We have to grow and experience these things.
Well, some of us were born leaders. 'Cause
Yes.
Firstborns. Firstborns in the family are just natural
You
leaders.
just have to be.
Which we established yesterday in our pre-chat.
Yes.
I'm going to go to the audience now so that you don't feel completely vulnerable and all
Perfect,
alone
perfect.
talking about your leadership fails, because apparently there are a few in the room. And I'm going to start with Bruce Power. There was someone on Bruce Power who had said they would be willing to share a story. It might be you. And while the mic gets to you, just as a bit of a heads up, at least so you know, they weren't completely, this is not completely spontaneous. They did get a bit of a heads up. So thanks for being here, but
Well, I was told I'm getting a question on COVID-19, not something I messed up.
Okay, well, that's the spontaneous part.
Well, thanks. Actually, you know what?
If you can stand so
yeah,
everyone
absolutely.
can see you.
So, you know, actually, in a really good example that first came to mind when we started talking about COVID-19 you know, a lot of people talked about PPE in the last panel and Lifelabs, and we really put a push on to get PPE. We had no PPE. We ended up securing about 3 million pieces that we donated. But one of the real concern we had was N95 masks. And they were, you know, we didn't know if every employee would need an N95 mask to work in the nuclear plant. So we bought into this pitch that somebody gave us that we should buy an N95 mask cleaner. And everybody laughs at that now, right? Saying, why would you buy an N95?
No one even laughed because no one knew what you were talking about.
Who is...
What's an N90? What is that?
Well, you know, an N95 surgical mask.
Right.
And at the time, people thought we would have to keep reusing these masks over and over. So we made many really good investments during the pandemic, but in the first 2 weeks, we went and bought a pile of N95 mask cleaners, which are still not used to this day. But nobody ever gives me a hassle for buying those because the other 9 out of 10 things we bought, we used. So from a failure of leadership, I don't think it was so much of a failure, but a recognition that sometimes when you need to move quickly with a lot of agility, with a short amount of time, you are going to make calls that in hindsight don't look as attractive as if you had taken the time. But when time is of the essence, you need to move on it. So that's one I can think of, and you put me on the spot, and hope that cuts it for you.
That was fantastic. Can
Thank
you pass that microphone to that man at the back, please?
Who's that?
Thanks.
Do you know? Did you get an advance of the question? Okay, so you're on the spot too.
But I think you raised your hand when we were talking about leadership fails.
I did, so definitely didn't get advance notice.
That's what
Nancy and I had an opportunity to work together way back when, so that was a real pleasure. So in so many ways, I have embraced the same philosophy of failure as a learning. And I would say as a leader and as a sort of a high achiever as a kid, once I finally broke through the idea that you can reframe a failure as a learning, like a whole world opened up for me. To the point where I would say when I promote my marketing team as the best marketing team in this country, I love to say it's because of the culture of learning. So it's really something that I've embraced personally. It's made me, I think, a better human, and it's made me more sane. And I highly advise it. So I don't think about things I mess up. I just think it's another learning opportunity. And in fact, I have a learning journal. So I have this Google Docs that's just like a long list of reflections. But then I just kind of write it down, and I feel like there's sort of like, a way to remember the learning.
That's awesome. But I pronounced your name Maha?
Maya.
Mm-hmm. Maya,
Yeah.
thank you. Before you go, there was a lady in the back who had a leadership hack. I forgot who put up their hand. Yes, thank you. But we'll go to this man over here.
Sure. So I guess
Your name, please?
Thomas Davies.
Hello, Thomas.
Just to make it public who this is that's going to talk all about his failure. I was hoping to fly under the radar there. So my failure was probably not changing my leadership style when we did go to the pandemic. When we were back in the office, I thrived in a leadership based on ambiguity. I wanted creativity for my team. I didn't want to give them a rail to ride down. Thought I'd make it ambiguous what the task was so that they would come up with their great ideas, which were always better than mine. When we went into the pandemic and we started working from home, they didn't have a regular touch point with me throughout the day, an opportunity to chat. And what I realized was this ambiguous culture was creating anxiety. in the team. And I know through that pandemic, we lost talent as a result of that management style. So, you know, it's all great that we might be coming back to the office part-time for my management style, but what I need to do is I need to change the way we manage and provide the team a little bit more focus and rigor so that they know what they're doing. And this is especially important now that we're hiring more neurodivergent team members who need that structure to be able to, you know, succeed and thrive.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Really appreciate that. If you can actually send it to him, and then we'll go to this woman here. We have two more, I think, because I'm going to call on Sprott, because Sprott's right in my eye line. But Sprott had a heads up.
Hi. Thank you. I'll share my fail in this very open room. So I think the biggest mistake I had was truly believing that I was driven by a fear of failure. But it was not the case. I'm not afraid to fail. Where my fear was admitting that I had failed or I had made a mistake. And so I had actually learned this before the pandemic. And when the pandemic had hit, I knew at that time that this wasn't a time for me to fail. And that's when the vulnerability came out to say to my team, I don't know what's happening or what's going to happen, and I don't know what we're going to do, but I do know that we're going to do it together. And so as I began to be very open and vulnerable about how I felt about where we were going and what we were going to do, I also realized that the other layer to add on was authenticity, because I saw other leaders within my own organization who were tapping into that as well, but they weren't doing it in an authentic way. And you don't build trust if you're pretending to be vulnerable or pretending to care about your people.
They'll see right through that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So without that, without coming back to the next conversation and following up on those very vulnerable and open conversations you've had, you're going to lose that trust faster than if you didn't open up in the forefront. So, so that was my biggest mistake, was just not admitting them with my team. And
now, was it a mistake or was it a learning?
It was a learning. So.
Okay. Okay, Jennifer, thank you. And our final one is with Sprott. I wasn't sure who was going to share from Sprott, but.
Well, it's Peter Groskopf.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a big believer in learning from failure. In fact, I think it sets the foundation for future success. I've personally developed an entire CV of failures and yet a lot of successes as well. I think during the pandemic, we were very fortunate. Our company was able to go virtual very quickly. And big reason for that is we had such a great team that took on a lot more responsibilities. But what's tough to fix when you're virtual like that is the things that are going wrong. And, you know, with a company our size, there's always one or two projects or products that are not going right. And I think what was difficult, and perhaps can be considered a failing, is that it's hard to fix difficult things over Zoom. It's hard to meet with those people. It's hard to have empathy. And it's hard to kind of shut them down or close them off or make a change. And I think that was the learning I had during the pandemic.
Thank you so much for this, Peter, and everyone who offered. Thank you. You give yourselves a hand for that, because it's hard to admit when things aren't going right, but this is part of the learning of life. And Nancy, maybe you have some comments based on some of the things you just heard.
It is, thank you, first and foremost, for sharing. It is truly a learning, right? It's all learnings, and we all have the list. I think it's, you know, I joke with my team when I joined, what are the top things? And I think, you know, as I hear different experiences, it's great to hear that people are reflecting on these things. But also, I think it's just, how do we anticipate from what we've learned so we can support the other generations? We're working in a workforce that there's so many new people who've never even worked before, so they're entering into the workforce. And those of us who've kind of been a little bit more seasoned with the learnings.
Are you assuming I'm seasoned?
No, I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at the room. But some of us who've had these experiences, it's how do we take that forward and pay it forward to make it okay? And as it's been said, like, you can't be fake about this stuff, right? It's not about reading a book and saying, okay, these are the 5 things I need to know as a leader, but it's your own narratives and stories, and none of them today are exactly the same, but they are the same in the same that they are authentic to you. And I think that's what we have to find, is our authentic voice, our authentic experience, and allow people who are entering in the workforce. We know at OMERS we have a very young workforce that's coming in that in many cases it's their first job. And I have a son who's just going to be 19 this week, and he said to me, he's like, Mom, I forget how to interact with people because it's been 2 years and he started his first internship, and he said, it's been so long, I don't know, do we shake hands? Do we, what is it like? So I just think we have to, again, and that's a, learning too. It's just some of the things that we've taken for granted, we have to re-educate ourselves and re-educate people around us.
And you just spoke a little bit about your son's hesitation and how to deal, even in this room, like meeting like this. I'm sure some of us were like, do we shake hands? Do we not do this? What do we do?
Mask, no mask.
Yeah,
I need that mask cleaner.
Yeah.
I'll use it.
It's sort of playing with our mental health, and this happens to be Mental Health Week.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and not just for this room, but the virtual audience also, if you want to offer some feedback around, as you said, everyone's a leader.
Yes.
Regardless of where you are on the in the title.
Yeah.
How has mental health impacted your leadership style, your work life? How has the awareness that we've all had around the pandemic and mental health changed the way you look at leadership? So this is a question for you, but also for the virtual audience if they want to tap in and put some questions or some answers in there.
Absolutely. I think at least for myself, we've all heard the analogy of, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, at least at the onset of the pandemic. I failed to do that. I mean, I would say those words, but I didn't really translate in terms of what that meant. And you just feel like it's that race, like just go, go, go. And it was one evening, I don't even know what time it was, and I was sitting in my room and I hadn't moved and it was dark. And my daughter at the time, she was 13, she came in and she said, Mom, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. But I just realized from her view of me, I'm sitting in a dark room. I couldn't even get myself to move, to turn the lights on, and I hadn't moved.
Wow.
And I just that was the moment of truth for me, that just breathe. Like I just thought I have to go, go, go. And you don't even realize in terms of emotional well-being sometimes that you're not well because you create your own new normals. And we did in terms of how healthy we were, in terms of what we were doing, physical activity, how we were connecting, the phobia of even being in a room with others. And sometimes it just takes someone from the outside to see you, to just make that reality of, maybe I'm not okay, and maybe I need to have a little bit more balance, and it's okay just to breathe and even stand up and turn the lights on.
I'm going to leave room for maybe one or two questions if there are any that are percolating. We only have a few more minutes, but one thing that you talked about in our pre-chat was the importance of diversity and inclusion. Having grown up in Toronto and being like this could have been a dream that I'd be in a room like this, because Canada has been somewhat delayed on getting into the conversation around diversity and inclusion, especially in corporate Canada. And then you also talked about Black Lives Matter and how the awareness of what was happening there in the States and how there were serious impacts here. How has that awareness changed you as a leader?
It's been an area that I've been always passionate about, and so it's not something that I just woke up and said, I'm going to focus on this area in human resources. But I've had a personal passion, even for myself, as an immigrant to Canada. I lived in 3 different continents before the age of 10. I was born in Iran. My family moved out during the revolution. Those of you who are old enough remembering the hostages that were, so there was a lot of shame growing up, and I didn't identify with what I would see on the news, and I didn't identify with my identity. So it's been personal for me because I didn't have that belonging when I was younger. And when I moved to Toronto, there wasn't as much diversity. So I experienced my younger brother getting bullied and others. So I've always had a desire to create more inclusion. I think you need to lead with inclusion because inclusion embraces so many different things for different people. It's not the same. We can't just say it's diversity, but it's very multifaceted. What has changed for me in the last 2 years and seeing what we've experienced with violence and just shocking emotions is just trying to really listen, not saying that we're all the same and trying to, understand everything because we're all different, but really listen to make change happen and try to truly ensure that we can put the right, things in place so that we are creating more equity and fairness and true belonging. So that's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight.
At least it's happening.
It's happening.
Okay.
And it has to live, at least for myself in the life of HR, is how do you embed it in everything you do? So it's not just a one-time event and it's not a checklist, but we all have to embody it. And the most important thing is the accountability of all of us, everyone in this room, in terms of how do I become better every single day? What am I committed to? So that's something for me is just opening it up and asking people to help me to be better and more inclusive.
I'm going to ask if there's a question from the virtual audience.
Yeah, we do have one. Someone is asking for your advice on managing up successfully.
In 30 seconds.
I think you have to be authentic and foster relationships. We've lost some of that, and that's managing up, across, and below to your teams. I'm a big advocate that you have to really foster first managing your teams and below and across before you manage up. And I've seen a lot of people fail in their careers because all they focus on is managing up. So again, the only advice I give is just be as inclusive as possible and focus on everybody and treat people fairly.
Well, that's not the only advice you've given today. You've given many great lessons on leadership. I want to thank you for this. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome.
Thank you for being such a great audience.
Thank you.
You can all stay there for a second. The next thing actually is another video that we're going to do similar to what we saw a few minutes ago. If we can just put on the video.
The primary areas of focus for us here at Sprott from a public reporting perspective is obviously ESG. Our shareholders are increasingly interested in how we are achieving that value creation in terms of our impact, directly or indirectly, on the environment, societal impacts in terms of good corporate citizenship, and our overall commitment to good corporate governance. So we do a lot around ESG and are very proud of our commitment to this important area. The important thing in my role is to be able to articulate our commitment to ESG and accomplishments in that area when it comes to our annual reporting, and to do so in a way that can be easily and clearly understood by our financial statement users. Mentorship is most effective when you are committed to your people on a genuine personal level. I also believe that effective mentorship is a highly interactive concept, which has obviously been difficult for any mentor to achieve over the last 2 years of the pandemic. So I've tried to keep much of a personal touch as possible over this time by limiting the extent of group Zoom calls, and reverting to one-on-one conversations wherever I can, preferably by phone. And some other examples include hosting a socially distant barbecue in my backyard last summer for top talent. And on one occasion, I went for a dog walk with a mentee of mine that got a new puppy during the pandemic. And I was able to use that time to help her to get some more thoughts around her career, and importantly, to gather some thoughts around how I could help her in terms of her career progression as we moved out of the pandemic. So I definitely had to pivot into new and innovative ways to mentor. But now my mentees are all asking that a lot of these approaches that we came up with collaboratively during the pandemic would continue as we move forward and return to the office over the next few weeks.
This is another video featuring one of Canada's best executives. I don't know about you, but I heard everything, and then I heard barbecue, and then I paused and I thought food, and then I wondered, would I be invited to this barbecue even though I'm not a member of Sprott? Am I? Would all of these people, you want to put your hand up so people can see who to get in the networking, how to get that barbecue going on? So if everyone wants barbecue, you know to go to, what's your name?
You just pivoted now. I said one.
Oh. Well, you can deal with that, the onrush of people out there. As I just mentioned, this is a networking break. This is your time to hang out, talk, stretch, get a drink. You've been a great audience. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for being here.